This was literally the first email I received in the new year. But instead of paying to upgrade my storage capacity, I wanted to figure out how to remove these LFS files altogether, as I don't need them. So let's embark on a short LFS journey and see how to check your GitHub LFS quota, how I maxed out my quota, should you use Git LFS, and how to completely remove LFS from a GitHub project. I'll also touch on how to partially remove objects in the case where you may want to cherry pick which files to keep and which files to remove from LFS tracking. Chapter markers are down below if you wish to skip ahead. Part of this video is sponsored by Badvert's USIDS, which is a early warning space debris detection system. More on that later. Sometimes the universe sends you a sign. In this case, it was a quota exceeded message from GitHub. I have a free GitHub account, which means you're given 1 GB of free storage for LFS objects. So checking on my account under settings, billing and plans, select plans and usage, and scroll all the way down to Git LFS data. And here it displays the total usage along with the size of your top 5 repositories. And as you can see here, I was a little over my 1 GB quota, which is why I received the email. So I was a bit dumbfounded seeing multiple repositories above 300 megabytes, as I thought I was fairly careful to not put large assets in them. I think the Cosmic Void was telling me that it's not about the file size, but about the file history. There were a few contributing factors that led to this large file storage calamity. Back in my Unity days, I made a video on how to set up Git LFS, which meant I created a basic template that included LFS configurations to filter images, videos, models, etc. Then over the next 4 years, reusing this template each time I made a new project, and you know in game dev, you're always creating new projects, I hastened the demise of my LFS quota. Another mistake I made was I was using high quality assets from Mixamo or some other source for my video projects and templates, which I would strongly recommend against, especially if you're just experimenting or getting started. Lately, I've been using Kenny's assets and Quaternius, which is another good source, and my project size has remained at a much more reasonable level. But I think the main takeaway here is that once an asset has been captured by the LFS storage system, it's always there. Even if you remove an asset from the project, merge in those changes, and delete the topic branch, because of the nature of Git, those old commits are still there and can be restored. LFS will keep those assets as long as there's a past commit that references it. If your initial commit and push to origin added, say, 500 megabytes worth of models, and your second commit removed it, if you had LFS tracking enabled, they will be there forever. Well, until you follow the instructions later in this video. So should you use LFS? Well, by default, no, you shouldn't use it. Only use LFS when you are absolutely ready to or when you need to. Consult with your team members and perform some research on how and why you should use LFS beyond these videos. I think the main purpose of Git LFS is to prevent repository size from ballooning out of control. For example, if you are not using LFS and you have a file that's 100 megabytes, which is the max file size, by the way, that GitHub allows, and you have 10 revisions of that one file, that's already a gig of data. Each clone down to your computer will include a gig of data just for that one file. In the game dev world, I think it's safe to say that models, images, and other assets will have many modifications over the course of the project, so you can see how this could become a problem over time. Git LFS allows you to store pointers to a file rather than the file itself. You put the file on some storage server, in this case, GitHub storage, and when you clone, you only download the assets relevant to whatever branch you check out. And as a little bit of a side note here, if you've cloned my 3D multiplayer template recently, or maybe one of my other projects and got a file corrupted error, the cause is likely because you didn't locally enable LFS and haven't downloaded the content for that current commit that you've checked out. I'm going to try to update this template project to remove LFS, so in the future, you won't have to deal with this issue. I think it's better to let users of the template to decide when and if they want to use LFS instead of forcing it on them. GitHub has a max file limit of 100 megabytes, but that doesn't mean you just automatically enable LFS once you get to that file size. You have to think about the assets your project or game will have as it grows. I think it's a good idea to stick with smaller size assets when starting out, and when you're ready, you can switch to higher quality ones. I'm not sure anyone can say when you should use it. Wait until you start adding X megabytes worth of files, or turn it on when you add this file type. I don't think it works that way. You have to balance the amount of storage your team is comfortable downloading for each clone, along with your budget and what you're willing to spend on storage costs. GitHub recommends keeping a repository size under 1 gigabyte, which can be very easy to hit for any growing game. It's difficult to make a solid recommendation for when to start using LFS, if at all. Are you adding new team members? Are the clones slowing down? That's a funny sentence. Did you get a letter from GitHub saying, hey, you've reached your limit, you need to figure out something to get this storage out of your regular repository and move it into some LFS somewhere? Of course, you can always host your own LFS server, and there are some alternatives, but that's for another time. Fortunately, if your project gets to a point where you want to enable LFS, you can apply it retroactively. We're actually going to look at the opposite functionality of that today by removing LFS pointers from our commit history. Whether you've reached your LFS quota or just want to reduce your usage, there's an easy way and a slightly harder way. The official GitHub LFS removal docs suggests that deleting and recreating the repository without LFS tracking enabled is how to remove your storage quota. So that's one way to do it. But that means you delete your repository from GitHub and you have to remove LFS locally and then recreate it in GitHub without the tracking enabled for those files in LFS. If you have a project that you don't care about deleting and recreating, this is a much simpler approach. However, if you've got a template project or one where a lot of people are watching it, have started, forked it, you have a bunch of outstanding issues, that doesn't really work. It deletes all of that. So this route wasn't an option for me. So the slightly harder way is to remove the files locally from Git LFS, uninstall Git LFS if you aren't cherry picking files, run Git LFS migrate export, force push those changes, and then contact GitHub support to actually remove those files tracked in LFS. Before we begin, I want to touch on that last one. If the goal is to remove your storage quota, then this method requires us to contact GitHub support to have them remove the files for us. However, it doesn't look like you can create support tickets without being at least a paid pro member, which is like $4 a month. I think they may respond to forum requests, but your mileage may vary there. The point is they get you either way. Instead of paying for increased storage capacity, I paid a pro membership 1 month to remove the problem. Also, I want to point out that not all repositories and project structures are created equal. I'm going to show you how to do this using a happy path with a very simple repository setup. If you need a more involved approach or you have some sort of custom requirements with the history, you'll likely want to use something like Git filter repo. So let's start the process. Make sure your repository is in a stable state. Wrap up any work or loose ends before performing these actions. If you have any outstanding branches, I would recommend merging them and really consolidate down to a simple main branch. That way that'll reduce any of the complexities that you may have trying to debug any potential issues. So under my Git LFS data usage, you can see I have a few repositories listed here. I'm not actually anywhere near the quota anymore because I practiced removing the LFS tracking on 3 or 4 repositories already, and some of them had upwards of like 300 megabytes, so I was able to get it down pretty quickly. But for this demo, what I'm going to walk you through today, I'm just going to use this Unity Cognito client one, which only has about 7 megabytes worth of data. But the data size doesn't really matter. What's important is the process that we can use to untrack the LFS files and remove it from our repository. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is establish a baseline for which files are currently in LFS so that we know what we're dealing with. So let's run git LFS ls-files. So you can see here we have some DLLs, some assets, and a PNG that make up our files that are being tracked in LFS. If you run this command and you notice that the files listed there don't quite add up to your quota amount, well, it's because it's not detecting all the files in LFS. This command right here is only going to work on the current checked out branch you have. So we need to run a more verbose command to get the LFS tracked files throughout the entire repository's history. So this includes files that have been deleted or that are on other branches. So let's go ahead and do that. So rerun the same command with --all to get us all the results, and we can do --long just to get the object IDs, and I'll touch on why we need those later on. So the list here is pretty much the same, if not identical with the list above. Yeah, it looks to be identical, which is fine, but you may end up in a case where you get a lot more files, and if you look at those files, you'll say, okay, then the sum of the data that these files use look like they add up to that quota, and that's what you should expect. So running this command should give you the full picture of all the files that are tracked in LFS, and that's what we're going to try to look at removing today. For this effort, I want to remove all LFS tracked files entirely from all branches. I want to remove LFS completely from this repository. You may not want that, and if you don't, you can actually cherry pick which files to remove. And that's where using the all and long parameters come in handy, because it exposes the full object ID of all those objects that are saved in the storage, and then you can turn around and give that to the GitHub support team, and they'll be able to quickly identify which specific objects that you want removed in the case that you want to cherry pick. However, in this case, I'm going to remove everything, so the object IDs aren't really as important to me. And there's another command I just want you to be aware of. I haven't found it terribly helpful, but it does give you a small insight into the LFS objects that are being tracked. The LFS migrate command is something that we'll use later on to reconcile the history of the changes when we need to rewrite it later on, and I'll touch on that more, but the info parameter here should give us some information about the tracked files in the repository. And you can see there, it didn't really give us too much information. So again, like what we did with the previous command with the -all parameter, let's do -- everything. And there we go. So these are the actual objects that we have in LFS. There's 17 files taking up about 4.6 megabytes. And if we look back at the repository itself, the number is a little off. This one's at 7, and I'm not really sure what the discrepancy is there, but I've done this like 4 or 5 times and it seems to work out correctly. So maybe there's some difference in how GitHub's calculating it versus these commands here. Next, we need to make sure we have all the LFS files locally from all remote branches. So run git LFS fetch --all. Then we need to make sure that we replace all the pointers with actual files on our current branch. So we run git LFS checkout. And you can see that it successfully checked out the 17 files that we noted to have above in the earlier command. So that looks good. Next, we can go ahead and uninstall LFS. It's important to note here that I actually want to completely remove LFS from this repository, but maybe you don't. Maybe you have some files that you'd like to keep and some others that you'd like to remove. So in that case, you wouldn't want to uninstall LFS, but rather untrack and migrate away from those specific files. And I'll get to that in a minute. So here we want to uninstall git LFS. So let's run git LFS uninstall. And that's it. So next, let's open up the git attributes file. This is where we decide which files we wish to track or untrack with LFS. So since I don't want any LFS tracking, I'm going to go through here and remove any file types that enable tracking with LFS. In the case where you'd like to keep tracking some files while removing others, you can run the git LFS untrack command on those files you wish to remove, or you can just manually remove the lines, which I'm about to do. You can run untrack against any file type like PNG, or like in this example, the .ogg file type. And if the command actually works, you'll see it print out untracking and then the file type that you untracked. If you run a git diff on the git attributes file, you'll notice that it has removed the line where you had enabled the .ogg file extension or whatever file type that you had removed or untracked. For this example, I'm going to manually remove all the file types that are LFS tracked. And for this git attributes file, it's basically everything below this point. And I'm also going to remove the LFS macro at the top. Since we've now removed tracking from all file types, or maybe specific file types in your case, we need to force Git to rerun the filters, which sets which files are tracked or not, and then you should see them get added to the index. I'm going to check in with my Git editor to see the status of the repository. And you can see here, the only thing that shows up for now is the removal of all that LFS tracking that I just did. All right, so I'm going to add that to the stage. So now let's go ahead and run git add renormalize so that we can force those filters to rerun. And then put a dot at the end. Let's check with our repository. And great, you can see all the files that were tracked with LFS have now been added to the index. The next thing we want to do is commit and push these files out to the origin. You'll notice that the git attributes file is still here and it has not been deleted. I've seen some instructions say that you can remove it at this point. However, the migration commands that we're going to run in a minute will actually add it back and add a line to it. So in the long run, I probably will remove it, but we'll touch on that more in a minute. So let's go ahead and commit these changes. So what we're doing with this commit is we're making sure that all of these files here that were previously tracked in LFS will now be tracked as proper files and not pointers in our repository. So we need to commit those changes before we update and rewrite our history. So let's go ahead and push that to origin. Perfect. So now the local master branch and the origin are now in sync. The next step we're going to run is going to be git LFS migrate export. This is potentially a very dangerous or destructive step as it rewrites the entire history of the repository to untrack those LFS files and transform them from pointers to actual files. And this includes files that we've already deleted. So why does this happen and why do we need to do this? If you've removed LFS like we just did and commit those changes without rewriting the history, GitHub is still going to keep all those files in storage because it assumes correctly that if you just go back one commit, well, LFS is enabled again, and they need to be able to identify those files that the pointers are pointing to. So you can't just check in those files like we just did and assume everything's going to work. You have to take it to the next step and rewrite your history so that you no longer have those files, so that GitHub can successfully delete the files in storage and know that you're not going to have some pointer somewhere that's pointing to some dead end. So what this next step is going to do, it's going to migrate back through the history and transform those pointers into the actual files that we just committed. If we look at the documentation for the git LFS migrate command, you can see we're going to run this export option, which will convert the git LFS objects to files in every local branch. If you were trying to cherry pick specific file types, like I mentioned earlier, you can use the include parameter to specify the specific file types that you want it to act on. But in this case, I want it to act on all the files because I want to completely remove LFS from this repository. So I'll be using this star option in this full command right here. So that's git LFS migrate export -- everything -- include equals, and then in quotes, put an asterisk. So go ahead and hit enter. And you can see here with this line that says prune, deleting objects 100%. So that means all 17 files that were subject to tracking are now converted to pointers. And that should go back through all the history and all the commits here. And you can see the actual file sizes of the pointers that were converted into the actual files. So everything looks good here. Let's check in on the repository status and see what just happened. You'll notice right off the bat that there's two sets of commit history now. This local commit history is the result of the migration command that we just ran. The history down here is still what's in our origin master. So somehow we need to figure out how to reconcile these two. So what we need to do is push out the updates that we just made, which remove the pointers and replace them with the actual files throughout the whole commit history, and somehow get that out to master. If we take another look at the git LFS migration docs, you'll notice down here it says that this will require a force push to any existing git remotes. So that's exactly what we're going to do. For this git editor, in order to use force push, you actually have to go under the advanced settings and check this allow force push checkbox. But when you're done migrating your repository, I recommend going back and unchecking this just to be sure you don't accidentally force push some changes in the future. You've been warned. But before we make the force push command, I just want to point out a couple differences between the two commit histories. So right off the bat, you may notice that in the latest commit here, you don't see any of the files that were tracked with LFS. It's just the git attributes. But if you look at what's still at our origin, you could see that it actually contains all the LFS files that we had removed from tracking. So what's going to happen when these two reconcile? Well, let's see. We run the force push. Go ahead and confirm. And look at that, it cleaned itself up. You no longer see two different sets of commit history. And if we look at that last commit again, it does not contain those LFS files that we had added earlier. It's just the git attributes. So the best way I can describe this is that once you apply the force push, the repository will go ahead and reconcile all of those LFS pointers back into the actual files. If we look at the commit history, this is before we actually made the force push, but then if we refresh and look at it again, you can see it just shows the git attributes. So that's what we expect. And if you notice here down at the bottom, that migration export command actually inserted this down at the bottom of the git attributes file. You can see that the export mode inserts a do not track entity, similar to had you have used the untrack command. My understanding that this is a catch-all to do not track anything in LFS. Now, if you don't want that, you can go in and remove it or just remove the git attributes file altogether at this point. Since the migration is complete, I don't see any harm in removing the git attributes file, and it's likely something I will do in the future. And let's go back into the terminal really quick. And let's just make sure that everything worked as expected. So let's run git LFS ls-files --all --long. And you can see there's no longer any files being tracked with LFS anywhere. So this migration worked successfully. And that command that I found not really helpful, let's just run that again just to see. So it's git LFS migrate info -- everything. And you can see there that we no longer have that LFS objects line anymore. So to me, this seems like it worked correctly. So the next thing we need to do is reach out to GitHub support and ask them to remove those files that we had previously been tracking in the LFS. And a side note here, officially to actually do this whole process, they want you to actually delete and recreate the repository. If you have a repository that's being shared or has stars or issues or forks or anything like that, all that information gets deleted when you recreate the repository. So I didn't really want to do it that way because I figured there's probably a lot of people that don't want to delete and recreate their repository for the same reason I do, is because I'm sharing them like templates so other people are using them and starring them and creating issues and working together and collaborating. So I didn't really think it would be a good idea to delete and recreate it. So I was definitely interested in an alternative, which is what we just did today. Now that's just how to migrate away from LFS in your repository, but you still have that data stored in their LFS server. So in order to remove it from there, you actually have to reach out and contact them. However, you can't create a ticket unless you have have a paid GitHub account. And I think the minimum is the Pro, and it's like $4 a month. So you can either pay for that or pay for a data quota increase. So to me, it just made more sense to just pay the one-time fee, get rid of all the LFS tracking because I'm not using it, and then just go ahead and cancel that Pro account at the end of the month. So for some of you, that might be an actual pain point because maybe you don't have the means to create a GitHub account. And it was kind of indicated to me that they do check the forum posts and may make an exception to allow for the removal of LFS objects in their storage. However, your mileage may vary on that. So the worst case scenario, you may have to pay $4 to sign up for that month and then remove all your stuff out of LFS and go ahead and cancel at the end of the month. So I'm going to go ahead and open a support ticket and ask them to remove all the files associated with that repository's LFS. Here's my LFS ticket. For the subject, I just said remove LFS from Unity Cognito client or whatever the name of the repository is. And then down here, I just said, please remove all data from LFS storage for the following repository, and then just provided a link to it. I had talked to support for a little bit. And by the way, they've been very helpful. So kudos to the GitHub support team. Thanks so much for the support recently. And they said best practice for them was to only provide one repository per request for removing LFS files. So that's what I'm doing here. And then right here, I just said, I've already removed the LFS files from the entire repository history. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and submit that. And in my experience, they're actually very quick with this. Like within an hour, they've had all my storage for every request I've made completely removed. So that's why my quota is so low, because they've actually been very fast with their support. And then the last little bit of cleanup isn't really a big deal, but if you want to just make sure that you removed LFS completely from your repository, there's a couple places to check. The first place is under Git LFS. And you can see there's some stuff there. So let's go ahead and just clean that up. So rm-rf.git into the Git folder and then /LFS. And I believe under the hooks configuration, there might be some more stuff there. So let's just check. And there's nothing there. So I believe the migration account took care of that. But in some cases, you may have some files like pre-push, post-checkout, post-commit, and post-merge. It's going to look something like this. And what you can do is just blow those away. Well, first double check that they do contain LFS stuff. Like you can see here, I had in a previous example that I was working through, I actually had these there, but I believe the migration command actually removes them. So I think I was doing things a little out of order earlier, but if you just want to be sure, you can just check with these files inside the .git/hooks directory to be sure you've cleaned everything up. Anyways, I think that's it for this video. If you have any questions or feedback about this video and how I approach this, maybe you have a better way to do this, let us know down in the comments. I'm sure it'll help somebody. Stay connected. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Is falling space debris constantly ruining your plans? Can never find the time to finish the yard work? Well, not anymore with Badvert's early warning space debris detection system. Download the USIDS app to confidently plan out your week without fear of raining spaceship parts. Don't ever leave the house again. Without our new Watch app, get real-time alerts of falling debris so you can safely seek shelter from the neutrino-laden wreckage. Get back outside with USIDS.